Well, I'm moving right along pretty fast here. We're going to go into the 18th century. But a couple things to say. Every time when I look at the videos, I think, oh, I forgot something, especially at the speed I'm going. Back in the 17th century, I should have mentioned that American literature begins. Finally, in this course, going in chronological order, I can talk about American literature as well. I'm sure the Native Americans had their stories and their epics, but it wasn't written. Well, it basically begins with the story of Pocahontas. That's the first famous story in American literature. It might or might not be true. Captain John Smith wrote the story about how Pocahontas, this Indian princess, saved him by putting her head on his head when her father was going to beat his brains out with a club. It's a well-known story. Now, Pocahontas was absolutely historical. She's quite an interesting woman, really. She was taken to London. She married. There's portraits of her. And that was in Virginia. That was very early, let's say 1610 or something like that. Anne Bradstreet is another one to mention. She was a poet. I think she was the first published American poet, Anne Bradstreet. She was puritanical from Massachusetts. And the poem of hers that I like to point out is a poem that she wrote upon the burning of our house. And why I like to point that out is because it shows something about the Puritan attitude. When her home, her house burned to the ground, her response was, "Thank you, Lord, thank you." Because it reminded her of where her true treasure was, in heaven, not on earth. The Puritans in Massachusetts were very religious. So there's that. All right, going on to the 18th century. This is approximately the 1700s. But by the end of the 1700s, by the time we get to 1790, things are absolutely changing. But the 18th century has some nicknames. I might be forgetting another one. It's sometimes called the Age of Reason. It's also sometimes called the Age of Enlightenment, when light pours in. The Neoclassical period, I think it's called that as well. And there's probably another name that I can't think of right now. All right, so history. Well, things settled down. At least in England they did. And I think in the rest of Europe they did as well. The 17th century had been wild, it had been violent, it had been a period of great extremes, but at least in England things settled down. There were great advances during this period. I say advances in quotes because, you know, in a way, in retrospect, you can look at some of this stuff from the 18th century and wonder, was it really so good? But I'll have to tell you about that later. But anyway, changes, at least, great changes in science and technology. Chemistry, for example. In the Middle Ages, they thought there were 4 elements: earth, wind, fire, and water. By the 18th century, they began to figure out that no, air has got oxygen in it, and that's different from carbon dioxide. And others as well. And also in technology. And I'll have more to say about that soon. Not today, I don't think. But by the end of the period, 3 revolutions had occurred. And here they are in order. The Industrial Revolution, which started approximately around 1750. And I like to think of it really as starting in Paris, but it was so influential on Britain. And it goes on in a way to this day. It started then, but it really hasn't ended yet. But I always like to point out to the students, it may end. I mean, I'm in a barn. I would like this farm someday to be a museum, the Old Ways Museum, because I'm interested in old ways of doing things. I'm not so enthused about the Industrial Revolution, but more of that later. The American Revolution. Well, around 1776, that's when the Declaration of Independence was written and signed. It very much an 18th century mindset in this new form of government, I think. And then the French Revolution, around 1790. Well, by that time, things were absolutely changing. And I'll say more about that later. So that's just a little history. Characteristics during the 18th century, what were people like? Well, they felt civilized. They were, I think, proud of themselves in a way, and they were so impressed with the mind of man, with reason, human reason. They felt that reason was in control. Overly, really, probably impressed with the human mind and what it could do. This was even to the extent that it sort of depressed religion, because reason itself became almost like a religion. People like things fancy, extremely fancy. Won't take the time now, but if you look at, well, and I'll tell you how you can see this stuff. Some of those carriages that were made at that time, I think usually I put here, e.g., for example, the furniture. I'll tell you how you can see some of that too. Furniture with intricate carving, way beyond what was necessary. And the feet of the furniture with like claws of animals carved. And also the interior of buildings, things gilded with gold, made extremely fancy. People liked that. They liked things that were artificial. Artificial was a good thing. I mean, an artificial flower took cleverness. Nowadays when we say artificial, that we tend to think, well, I'd rather have the real thing, a real flower, not an artificial flower. But in the 18th century, no, they liked things that were artificial. A way that you can tell the 18th century right away, if you see a movie or you see a painting, is men at that time wore white powdered wigs. White powdered wigs. And as a kid, when I first ran into that, I could in no way understand that. Why would men do that? But eventually I figured it out. I mean, it wasn't only that it was artificial and fancy, but by wearing white powdered wigs, a young man could look old. And that was a good thing in the 18th century, because somebody who was old, a man who was old, was liable to be richer and more powerful and more influential. People would listen more to somebody who was old, wiser maybe. And so men actually tried to look old. That's so different from the way it is now. Well, that's a start. This is Friday. I'm so aware of the time coming down. After today, I have 25 days to finish this class. 5 of those days, more or less, are going to be taken up with German. So, I'm going to have to move right along. I'll tell you more about that on Monday. I hope you have a lovely weekend. Bye.